we have a very special event, which is a conversation with Robert B. Zoellick. Bob Zoellick is going to be here to talk to us about a variety of aspects of US-China relations, which are, as I'm sure we all know, at their tensest point for something like half a century. One of the questions we're going to ask in a broad sense today is whether history can help us to understand why we've reached this point and what we can do about moving on from it. In the next decade, after all, global prosperity and indeed peace will depend on the bilateral relationship between China and the US being managed well. So how likely are the prospects of that? Well, not only do we have Bob Zoellick himself as a guide, but also some of the work he's been doing recently, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But just a reminder to all of you of the long career in public service that our guest today has had. Robert B. Zoellick has served, or brings almost in backward order, you might say, as president of the World Bank between 2007 and 2012. Before that, he served as Deputy US Secretary of State in the administration of President George W. Bush from 2005 to 6. And he was also US Trade Representative between 2001 and 5. He was instrumental in a whole variety of major US-China engagements, some of which we will talk about today, including China's entry to the World Trade Organization. But he also became extremely well known in the policy community and beyond in 2005 for a speech which called upon China to act as a, quote, responsible stakeholder in the global community. And of course, the question still remains to be debated about how far that message has been heeded and in what ways. But he's also, we should add, an author of this both fascinating and extremely erudite book entitled America, I can see that there, America in the World, which is subtitled A History of US Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. It's based on an immense amount of reading and also, of course, Bob Zoellick's own personal experience as a senior diplomat in terms of looking at American foreign policy across a wide sweep of historical experience, leading us pretty much up to the present day. And it's now available quite recently in paperback and an excellent read. So that will be our cue to talk not only about the present, but also about many of the aspects of the past where the US and China have related to each other. Bob, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us online at the Oxford China Centre today, and it's a pleasure to host you here. We will, of course, be talking about the book and about the history in it in just a few moments. But I wonder if we might start by setting the scene, by getting your reflections on where you think the US-China relationship is in the present day. How do we stand at the moment?
Well, first, Rana, let me thank you. I've been a great admirer of your histories, from which I've learned a great deal, and it's a real pleasure to be here with you and Todd, and appreciate sort of Claire's help, so thank you for the invitation. My friend Evan Feigenbaum, who's a true China scholar like yourself at the Carnegie Endowment, first made the observation that the US approach to China seems to be more of an attitude than a policy. And I think that that attitude is a reaction to various developments. The Biden administration has in many ways carried on the policies that began in the Trump administration, whether it's with tariffs and sanctions. And in the words of some of the senior people, they have made the conclusion that engagement with China failed. I think this is historically inaccurate. I've written to that effect. But nevertheless, that's probably a reasonable bipartisan political consensus at the present time. And some of the directions of Xi Jinping's heavy-handed policy, the wolf warrior diplomacy, the more assertive position, things he's trying to do with the rectification of the Communist Party have frankly contributed to the added difficulty. On the business and economic side, which used to be the main line of support for relations with China after the first opening, there's been anxiety about technology fears and theft, the more difficult economic environment. There's concern about whether China is developing a model of authoritarian development. I think China represents a combination today of some hubris and, in my view, insecurity, with the East rising, sort of West declining. We can talk about this. I think in international engagement, they have, not surprisingly, followed two paths. One is they've worked on the integration within the international community, which I was involved with, to try to sort of move norms and personnel towards their system. This is not a shock, others do this. But they've also had an option of another tier, which is to try to build international systems that follow more of a sort of middle kingdom tributary state model. The Belt and Road might be more like that. Of course, for the United States, as for Britain and others, a lot of this is driven by domestic politics. Nobody wants to look soft on China these days. And so I think where it leaves us, however, is in the US debate, we know what people don't like. It's not so clear what they want to do. We have very serious people talking about containment ideas, which I don't think will work and won't work with alliances. There's a notion of competition, but as I've prodded, so how do we define winning in this? So I keep trying to focus back on, well, what is it you want to accomplish with China, recognizing the changes? And I think to summarize, Rana, in a way, following up on Trump, there's been a sort of de facto decoupling economically as well as politically and security. And not surprisingly, Xi Jinping doesn't want to just be passive in this. So there's been a certain decoupling on the Chinese side. So I think that it's the Biden, President Biden himself could see the decline in relations. That's why he set up the video conference as kind of a way to put some support on it. But as I again wrote afterwards, I don't yet know where US policy wants to go afterwards. So there's a certain logic on the alliance side with the AUKUS and the Quad agreement and so on and so forth. But what do we want to accomplish with China? That's an open question.
Well, it's an immensely important question and one that we will continue to come back to as we continue our conversation. But I think it also prompts the thought that looking at the longer trajectory of China-US relations is a really important part of making those judgments. Can I start by asking, Bob, when you put, as I say, your book is not just about US-China relations, it is about US diplomatic relations across the piece. And, you know, some of the discussions, for instance, of Ronald Reagan and his engagement with the Soviet Union are also a reminder of how other difficult relationships have been managed successfully by the United States in recent years. But for reasons of time and concentration, we'll stick with the US-China story at this time. Did writing the book make you think that there were genuinely any themes over the kind of longer term that emerged from the shared history of your country and of China?
Well, I've always enjoyed history, and I studied diplomatic history when I was in college. And so, frankly, one of the reasons that I wrote the book was to try to encourage people to think about how they can apply and use history as they think about diplomatic problem solving. But particularly with China, there were some themes that I sort of had in the back of my mind that sort of came to the fore across, you know, the 150 or so years of the relationship. And there's three in particular. And the US relationship with China is quite unusual relative to other countries. It's different than it is with, say, the India or another big power, even sort of Russia. But one is the commercial opportunity. And I draw attention to the fact that even before we had our Constitution, Robert Morris, who was the financier of the revolution, sends the ship, the Empress of China, I think it was 1784, gets a huge profit of selling ginseng from Appalachia. And that really starts the whole notion of the great economic bounty to be in China, which was always a slight glimmer over the horizon, not quite achieved to the degree that people want. I have a book in my library that was from 1937 called 400 Million Customers by Carl Crow. And it's quite interesting. It's his story of both the positive and the negative experiences with sort of the Chinese economic market. Having said that, over the 15 years up to the Trump administration, it was the fastest growing export market for the United States for 15 years. So that's one thing. The second one, which I think is less recognized, but comes out from the history, is China as a potential power. So to reference one of the historical periods, in 1900, and partly prodded by some British idea merchants, the United States under John Hay promotes the notion of the open door. And one has to look at the context. Africa had just been carved up by European powers. The possibility that European powers plus Russia and Japan might do the same. And the United States not only had these two open door notes to emphasize open commercial opportunity, but it was very much focused on the territorial integrity of China. It's quite interesting why this was so important. Ella Hurut, who was quite an important figure in US Secretary of War, later Secretary of State, sort of compares the breakup of China to the breakup of the Roman Empire. So there's this notion of its importance. In 1921 and 22, in some of the period where you have researched, you have what's called the Washington Naval Conference, which, while it focuses on naval arms control, it's also very much about East Asian security. And you can see the effort in the United States to try to strengthen the young Republic of China with sort of economic tools. For real students of China, they may recall that one of the issues that hurt Woodrow Wilson with the League of Nations was that the Treaty of Versailles had given Shantung, the German area, back to Japan. And this was a very politically unpopular issue in the United States. And the 21-22 arrangement actually got Japan to give Shantung back to China. In World War II, as your work with, for at least the American publication calls it, Forgotten Ally, you have FDR, who believed that China would be one of the four policemen in the post-war order. Nixon, with the triangular diplomacy 50 years ago, emphasizing China's sort of role in triangular diplomacy. And to a degree, what I was talking about with responsible stakeholder was whether China would assume responsibilities in the system. So there's this notion of China as a potential power. But there's a third aspect that is as important as the other two and is often overlooked in our secular society, which is the missionary experience with China. Britain had some of this as well. And there were thousands and thousands of young Americans that go to China as missionaries. And equally important, it's their children who become the window on China in the 20th century. So Pearl Buck writes this best-selling book about the good earth. It becomes a movie. Many of the American diplomats, Stape Roy, who worked with me, were children of missionaries. Henry Luce, the founder of Time magazine, children of missionaries. The universities. And so it becomes a key component for people trying to have a view of China. And the missionary experience, I think, is very important because in some ways, what Americans have been seeking to do with China over 150 years is to convert them, either to Christianity, to capitalism or commercialism, or perhaps small r republicanism. And when the Chinese decide to be Chinese as opposed to fellow Americans, there's a sense of rejection that's quite strong. And you can see this again in the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. You see it in 1949. And as you've also written about how the book about Stilwell and the American experience in China changes the attitudes. 1989, and perhaps we're encountering today. So there's a notion that the relationship becomes somewhat of a pendulum of trying to convert the Chinese adopt it for a while, then they reject it and decide to go on their own course. And there's a notion of it's a worse than a relationship where you just have normal ties because you feel in some ways that the other side has rejected what you're trying to bring. And so in some ways, one of the lessons of this would be to try to see China as it is, not as we wish it to be. That doesn't mean you don't work with it, but you have to understand where China is coming from its own sense of self.
I think that's a really astute point, and one that actually even now, in the UK, where I'm sitting now, and where many of our participants, of course, are coming from today, we're beginning to have a debate that's been underway for a while in the US. We just didn't tend to think about China very much until probably 2 or 3 years ago. But already, I sometimes like to say, slightly impolitely, that we've moved from a period of complacency to a period of hysteria without an intervening period of deepening of knowledge. And I think that's where we have to come. I'd also add one other to your distinguished list of what sometimes were nicknamed Mish kids, in other words, people who came from missionary families. The journalist John Hersey, who became famous actually for his writing on Hiroshima and the destruction of Hiroshima after the war, but wrote actually one of the best novels, sort of based on his own experience in some ways, I think, called The Call, which is about the rise and ultimately, when the communists took over, the fall of the missionary presence in China. And it's a very stimulating.
Well, also, Rana, Americans are influenced by movies. There was a fantastic movie called The Sand Pebbles, which really covers some of the period in the 20s and sort of the uncertainty about Chinese sort of modernization. So we have to bring Hollywood in here too.
Definitely, we should do that. And we should never forget Anime Wong, of course, the first sort of Chinese American star of that era, who did a lot to bring China to a wider Hollywood audience at that time. You've given us that overview and these three themes, which I think actually people will find very indicative: the commercial opportunity, China's potential power, and the importance of the missionary experience, which are distinct to the American-China encounter. But also, of course, it's one thing that's worth remembering, again, implicit in what you said, is that the early 20th century, a period that you study in some detail in your book, is also the period where America is coming into being as a potential and then a real power, as Britain's power begins to decline in China and the rest of the world, slowly but surely in the 20s and 30s, America is beginning to step up to the plate. And I want to spend a bit of time just exploring a few of the personalities who make the wider trajectory of that story. I'm going to go back to one of the events you mentioned, which is the Washington Naval Conference of 1921-22, perhaps less well known to generalists than the Versailles or the Paris Peace Conference, which ended with the Versailles Treaty just a few years before, 2 years before, in fact, in 1919, but actually very, very important. And at the heart of that, there's a figure who was at that time one of the biggest figures in world politics, but now maybe not so well remembered. That's Charles Evans Hughes, a man who spanned every aspect of public life, from the judiciary to politics and authorship as well, I think, in America. Tell us a little about him and why you think Hughes' contribution at the Washington Naval Conference helps us to understand this wider issue of bringing Asia into a world where arms control is managed in an effective and in some ways quite tactful way.
So one of the reasons actually I wrote the book is that when I was in government service, I often had younger associates, and I probably used to torture them a little bit about asking historical questions because I was intrigued with what they had learned. And I discovered that insofar as they had learned some history, it tended to be post-World War II on. But there's some fascinating figures, not only in the 19th century, but in the first part of the 20th century. And Charles Evans Hughes is one of those. Charles Evans Hughes was a very successful governor of New York. He actually runs for president in 1916 against Woodrow Wilson, almost wins, only loses because of about 3,400 votes in the state of California. He becomes Secretary of State in 1921 under the Harding administration, and there's some interesting lessons about how he works with his president because Harding was not known as a great foreign policy leader. As you say, he becomes one of the most important and successful Chief Justices of the Supreme Court going into the Franklin Roosevelt area. And one of the parts that I try to draw out in the book is he was obviously a very good lawyer and sort of his problem-solving nature. And remember, this is 1921. Woodrow Wilson has just suffered the defeat, not only election, but the Versailles Treaty, the League of Nations. The Senate in the United States is so full of itself that a Republican senator of his own party says, it doesn't matter who's Secretary of State, we're going to control everything anyway. And so part of the story is how Hughes sort of re-engages internationally. But again, from a transatlantic context, much of this will be missing because in a sense, while the United States separated itself from European security, not European economics, it's quite active in the Asia Pacific. And what the Washington Naval Conference is about is not just sort of lowering battleship levels. It's very much about East Asian security arrangements as an alternative to the League of Nations. It highlights the importance of arms control as a process as opposed to result. As history would show, one has to reassess, reinforce, constantly sort of redirect. And it actually is very important in building the US relationship with Great Britain that leads into World War II. Balfour is the representative. Nobody wanted the job to come to the Washington Naval Conference. And you can see, and I draw this out in the chapter, how at a personal level, Balfour and Charles Evans Hughes connect. And there's a degree of trust. And of course, students from Britain will recall that Britain had a key treaty with Japan that had been negotiated and reaffirmed a number of times. And the United States wanted that treaty to go away. We didn't want to have Britain and Japan basically as a balance against the United States in the Pacific. And indeed, that treaty was ended. But there's an important Chinese dimension of this, which again is sort of lost in most of the arms control discussions, because students of China will recall that Japan during World War I had tried to take advantage of the situation. There was the 21 demands of 1915 against China, which really backfired with Chinese politics. As I mentioned, the return of Shantung for Chinese scholars is the May 4th movement, which is critically important in trying to understand sort of a modernization of China. And so going back to these open door principles that I mentioned from John Hay, in a sense, Hughes is picking up these principles and trying to connect them with what I call the developmental policy for China. And there was some British interest in this as well. So the idea would be, could one strengthen Chinese control over its customs systems, its railways, its telegraphs, its own territory, sort of get the ability to have effective governance? This is also an interesting window in Japanese policy, because you have a group of Japanese internationalists that had been linked very much to the British economy and the Meiji Restoration following the notion of the British monarchy, but they see the shift in economic power. So they start to shift to the idea of, could they have an effective relationship with the United States? The Japanese move away from interference in China, but not Manchuria. And Manchuria is a very important reminder, even to today, if we think about Northeast Asia, because this is the area of, in a sense, the great powers, whether Russia, China, Japan, the United States, Britain, sort of coming together. This is the area of the warlords. So can you be able to get some sort of concentration of power? And a Japanese scholar from Harvard, Akira Irai, actually talks about this as an economic foreign policy alternative for Japan. Of course, it fades away by the end of the 20s with the success of the imperialists. The Great Depression puts the final nail in the coffin. But if you look at Japanese policy after World War II, this is exactly the successful policy that they followed. It's sad because it shows the importance of follow-up of detail. Some of the agreements that were made at the Washington Naval Conference, like customs revenues, are blocked. The French block a conference. There is some effort to, by the way, negotiate debts, as we've seen in other environments, and that sort of doesn't move forward. So it's an interesting window on a brief but important aspect of, could China become a successful republic and part of the international system, as your book then goes on and takes it to what happens in the 1930s.
And thanks, amongst other things, well, thanks first of all for your kind words, Bob, but also bringing up that question of the customs tariffs, I think is a really interesting thing, because at one level, those who, unlike you, have not spent a lifetime dealing with questions of economics and trade might say, oh, customs tariff, most boring subject in the world. But actually, in some ways, they are absolutely central to the way in which China either succeeds or fails in becoming a full member of the international community in the 20s and 30s. It's actually not till 1930 under Chiang Kai-shek, the leader who follows the warlord leaders who were there in the early 20s, that China regains most of its tariff autonomy. And that's vitally important in terms of getting an income stream that enables it to solidify. It's also, of course, part of the origins of why even today, as you know better than most of us, China is very sensitive about how it negotiates trade issues, because there's a strong kind of muscle memory of that earlier period when China was not in charge of its own trade.
Just to develop that point, this is again to the sort of the advantages one gets from a historical perspective. Up until 1916, when the United States put in an income tax, about 40 to 50% of US revenue was from the customs system. So frankly, the United States would not have been able to fight and finance World War I if it hadn't been for the income tax. And so for China, as you said, it's not only a question of sovereignty, its ability to control its borders, it's revenue.
It really is. And of course, in the UK, we note the fact that for the first half century of the Chinese maritime customs existence from the mid-19th century, it was, in fact, a man from Northern Ireland, an Ulsterman called Sir Robert Hart, who was actually in charge of it. And that's a whole other fascinating story. Let me put to you another aspect, though, of the Washington Treaty story and of Charles Evans Hughes's role in it, Bob, that still puzzles me a bit if we try and use it as applied history, so to speak, thinking about what analogies there may be for wider US-China practice. Because on the one hand, in the short term, it was an example of really masterful diplomacy. Hughes, at least in your account of him, and I think it seems to be absolutely right, knows where the sensitivities are with the Japanese, with Prime Minister Hara Takashi, who has a very difficult situation at home where the military want to go a certain way and the civilian leadership of Japan wants to go another. And China's Hughes is very sensitive about that. He even manages to soothe the ruffled feelings of the French, who feel they ought to have a bigger navy than they give them permissions for. So that diplomacy is very successful. And yet, as we know, less than 10 years later, at the London Naval Conference of 1930, actually the agreements of 1921, where there was an agreed proportion of how big the navies could be, the British and the Americans would have a certain proportion of the navy, and the Japanese would get about three-fifths of the size of that navy. All of that basically seemed to turn to dust and instead lead to the arms race that we've come to know of as the Second World War.
So this is why it's important to understand the historical context in which a diplomat works. So as I mentioned, this is 1921. In the United States, and to a degree, I think this happens in Britain as well, there's a huge letdown after World War I, a sense of great loss, and yet the system doesn't seem to have been fundamentally reformed. Part of this is the high expectations that Woodrow Wilson and others sort of put forward. And so in the United States, there had been a huge battleship program that had been laid out in 1916. But one of the realities that Hughes had to deal with was the Congress wasn't going to be funding this. And so the challenge was, in a way, whether Japan had also laid down a huge naval program, is that whether you would have the spending for an arms race for both battleships, but also for some of the fortifications, or would you create stability, a balance of power arrangement at lower levels? Now, this goes back to your example in the 1930s. I think one of the unfortunate aspects is that people focused on those ratios that you mentioned, the 10-10-7 sort of ratio with Japan, and they lost, in a sense, they focused on the technicalities of arms control as opposed to seeing it connected with the regional security agenda. Now, for critics of the Washington Naval Treaty, it's interesting. The Congress never actually appropriated the money to even spend up to the limits. And so there's in sense, Charles Evans Hughes got the best deal that he could given the congressional spending. But there's also, one has to keep aware of the technology development. So of course, battleships were the nuclear missiles of their age. They were the big sort of powerful weapons. When battleships were regulated, some of the technology competition turns to aircraft carriers, submarines, and of course, there's a wonderful example that Nimitz, who becomes the commander of the Pacific Navy in World War II, does his War College thesis on how the United States could project power in the Western Pacific without the bases that had been sort of precluded by the treaty. And so you partly develop the Marine expeditionary capabilities that become very important for the United States in World War II. And the reason I draw this out is that as you think about arms control today, it's important to see it beyond the individual technical nature of nuclear weapons being discussed. It's important to see it in regional security. Now, just to give you two practical examples, I wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago. They asked me to write about the negotiations with North Korea. And I was trying to explain, partly based on this history, if you think about security in dealing with the Korean Peninsula, you can't just look at it in terms of nuclear weapons. You have to look at the great power competition, the economic developments. Frankly, I was focused on some of the conventional war aspects. And so you have to put arms control in a regional security context. And today, this will be the exact issue that we watch with Iran with the negotiations. Is it enough to have limits on Iranian nuclear capacity, but not missiles or projection of some of their parastatal forces? So these issues from history keep coming back to us in different forms.
I think that's a really important point in terms of understanding the context, as well as the very specific elements that get negotiated. And that question of the bigger picture leads us rather naturally to something that's very potent for the week that we're speaking in, actually, which is the week, of course, that I think 50 years ago plus 1 week, the visit of US President Richard M. Nixon to Beijing, thereby breaking the silence that had existed between China and the US since 1949. And I think most, if not all, of our participants today will be knowledgeable enough to be aware that we are sitting in the year and the month of the 50th anniversary of the week that Nixon himself termed the week that changed the world. And inevitably, I think your book has a chapter that looks at the politics of that period. But I found it intriguing because although the event itself is extremely well known, some of your judgments are more nuanced, and in some ways even critical in certain ways, of both what was done at the time and the aftermath of that particular visit and the negotiations of Nixon and Kissinger, the two major policymakers of the time. One of the things that you point out is that in some ways, or at least you argue, in some ways, that what Nixon and Kissinger are doing is almost admitting that there is a sort of period of American decline. And this real sort of epoch-breaking event, the visit to Beijing, is a piece of kind of spectacular showmanship that slightly conceals the fact that elsewhere, it looks like they're stepping back rather than pushing forward in terms of American leadership. Is that a fair summary of what you're saying in the chapter? And if so, how would you sort of flesh that argument out? Because in some ways, you're being quite controversial there.
Well, I admire aspects of the diplomacy, but you're focusing on the key point that I try to draw out, which is it's amusing today in that, the papers are talking about, are we in a new age of multipolarity? Well, this is what Nixon and Kissinger were talking about around 1970, so it's not all that new. But again, to take the context, it's important to think for Nixon, his chief of staff makes this point in the diary. From day one, Nixon was a war president, and that dominated the White House every day. And Nixon and Kissinger, to their credit, realized they were going to be managing a retreat. And retreats are extremely difficult to manage, whether in military terms or diplomatic terms. And what they had in mind, by the way, is another good insight for when the US left Afghanistan. I would have advised the administration to have an offsetting initiative. And this offsetting initiative not only was a way, in Nixon's terms, about countries need great ideas if they're going to continue to be great, and he believed that the role of statespeople was to give history a nudge. He also had an idea of this in foreign policy and democratic societies. He figured that audacity would build public support. And of course, then this merges with Kissinger's sort of work, going back to his thesis and the Congress of Vienna, which is how do you achieve stability amidst perpetual change? So the change that they saw, as you mentioned, was they thought that the United States was moving into an era where it no longer had the economic dominance that it had after World War II, which was sort of an unusual period. They were trying to fashion a new balance of power, a new map of power. And of course, their prime focus was the Soviet Union. It wasn't a China card, as people referred to it. It's a notion of a triangular diplomacy where you sort of have to manage the relationships with both. And it's a recognition that you could have shared interest even if you don't have shared beliefs, which, by the way, may be an interesting concept for us to think about with China today. And in the bigger picture, to be fair to them, this was an era where we had almost gone to nuclear war with the Soviet Union in 1962, not long before. There was the chance that China and Russia were going to go to war. They were trying to avoid wars between great powers, which I think is a good thing to do. We're facing that one today. They were certainly trying to prevent nuclear war, and they're trying to prevent nuclear expansion. Now, where I distinguish it from another example is I have a chapter on Hamilton, where most people know Hamilton as the economic statesman, but I also show how he was trying to develop a realistic foreign policy that complemented his creation of economic power. You could argue that Nixon and Kissinger were doing the reverse. They were trying to reorder power politics because of a perceived decline in US economic power. And so you're right, where I'm critical is the fact that they underestimated the United States economic innovation capacity. By the 1980s, Reagan, who took a very different approach, believed that the United States could actually be far more powerful from the Soviet Union if you unleashed its economic innovation. And then we're in a world of information technology and other advances, which frankly, after the doldrums of the 70s for Europe and to a degree Japan after the oil crisis, the United States, you have this resurgence in Western Europe and the United States that frankly the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe can't keep up on. And so what, perhaps this is, we're bringing in a little bit of my economic perspective, I think as you think about diplomatic maps of power, one needs to combine the stabilizing notion of balance of power with a recognition of the dynamism of the economic system and a continued adaptation to it. And by the way, I've got a piece coming out in Foreign Affairs later this month that tries to build on this idea.
Well, look forward to reading that as well. I can't resist asking Bob. I don't know whether you and Henry Kissinger get to hang out at Republican Statesman Summer Camp at any time, but have you put your critiques of his tactics to him directly at any point? After all, he's still alive and with us.
I have great admiration for Dr. Kissinger, not only for what he accomplished, but also for how he's maintained his status and standing over the course of these 50 years. And I'm privileged to take part in a small group, actually, that we have video conferences on, and he still remains extremely good value. He's now, I think, about 98, 99, but he's very, very, very thoughtful on issues. He has read my book, and we've talked a little bit about it. What he focuses on is one other little theme, which is, while I believe the theme of that chapter is kind of realpolitik, beyond realism, realpolitik in an American variety. And I try to also explain how to be successful, a US foreign policy has to include other ideas in the American foreign policy pantheon, including ones that fit more with sort of the American values and democratic and economic notion. And so Kissinger, I think, fairly sort of tries to explain, or would argue, that given the hand that they were given, the challenge of really maintaining public support for American foreign policy sort of fit more his realistic model. One of the points about these other chapters, whether it's sort of Ronald Reagan or Bush 41, which I talk about with alliance management, or frankly, Ella Harud in international law, Charles Evans Hughes with arms. So I'm trying to draw in the fact that there are other themes in American foreign policy that one needs to be aware of to be successful.
Thanks indeed. And I may just do a quick plug here, if I may, is in that Bob was kind enough also to give contribution to a recent BBC radio documentary, which I hosted, called Archive on Forward, The Great War, which looks at that history of US-China relations from the Nixon visit all the way up to the Trump administration and indeed the present day of the Biden administration. And if you want to hear more of Bob's views on some of those issues, please do check it out free online. I can see that questions are really kind of beginning to come in, and I want to make sure that we get time for those. A lot of them are quite present oriented, as you might expect. Before we get to that set of questions about the present day, which I know people are burning to ask you, Bob, indeed I am too, I want to just bring in one other historical example, one that is sort of, again, relatively close, at least in its effects to the present day, because it speaks to one of the issues which may, I think, shape the nature of the US-China relationship, whether it's competition or collaboration, for the next few decades to come, and that is the field of technology. So you bring up a profile of someone who is, well known perhaps to historians of science and politics, but perhaps not a household name in quite the same way as Nixon and Kissinger. And that was a scientist named Vannevar Bush. Could you tell us about what it was that shaped his view of the US's role in terms of technological development, and how that essentially shaped a great deal of the Cold War period from the US's point of view?
Yeah, he's another fascinating figure. And as you suggest, I included that chapter because I believe that science and technology will be really important to future international relations. So I wanted to emphasize that element. So Vannevar Bush was a polymath engineer. He was a successful entrepreneur. He was a vice president at MIT. He runs the Carnegie Science Foundation. And during World War II, he basically becomes Franklin Roosevelt's conduit to the American science and technology community to try to bring science applied to war. And I opened the chapter. Some of this, history is stranger than life. You can't make these things up. July 1945, 3 events. The test of the atomic bomb, where Vannevar Bush was the key liaison with Franklin Roosevelt. Second, he writes a report, which he gets FDR in 1944 to ask him to do, called Science, the Endless Frontier, which defines the future American science policy we'll come to. But the third is he writes an article in the Atlantic magazine where he basically is conceiving of something that he calls the Memex machine, which looks an awful lot like a personal computer. And remember, 1945, you're just starting to get the big computers, much less a personal computer. And it turns out this radar technician going off to the Philippines comes across a reprint of this article in a Red Cross library on stilts, comes back and becomes one of the engineers that helps develop the whole personal computing sort of revolution. One of Bush's graduate students helps found Silicon Valley as the provost. And so the story in the larger point is that what Vannevar Bush was trying to do was to, in a sense, the United States had never really had much of a science policy, had been founded by foundations. He was trying to figure out how the United States government could support science while keeping a room for mavericks and experimentation and not having bureaucracy. So the heart of the idea in his science report, The Endless Frontier, is at Stanford, it's called the triple helix. So the idea of basic scientific research funded by the government, universities being drawn into it, but being independent, and then also the business sector and how those three will connect. And I think there's a fair argument to be made, going back to what my quick rendition of history of the 70s and 80s, that the US success against the Soviet Union ultimately was because we had the technological innovation capacity that the Soviet command economy could not keep up with. Now, frankly, Vannevar Bush would have done it differently than some of the bureaucratization of science that we've seen develop. But again, this is a wonderful issue today, just to give you a sense that historians can have some effect on things. One of the bills that is being debated now in the US is passed by the Senate, the House has a version, was called the Endless Frontier Bill. And this wasn't accidental. Todd Young, a senator from Indiana, read my book and was kind of interested in the support of science and technology. But the question they'll face is, how much it is the basic research and how much will it be subsidizing industries like semiconductors? So these issues sort of come back. Now, to bring this forward with China, I think one of the issues, of course, will be China has invested a huge amount in terms of science and technology. It's clearly part of Xi Jinping's strategy for the future. But will a society that limits freedom and debate and sort of the role of oddballs and mavericks, will it be as successful in innovation? Well, we'll partly find out. That's one of the challenges going ahead. I still put my money on knowing a little bit about the technology space and business on you have to have room for people to try crazy ideas and entrepreneurialism. But I want to draw one other connection that I think is important around it, which is one of the reasons I put this chapter in was thinking about science and policy more generally. So if you think about climate change, or you think about pandemics and biological security, you have to think about how science and policy will interact. And again, to give you a very practical example, one of my other missions in the Bush 41 administration, I worked for James Baker at the State Department for 4 years. And I was the person responsible for what was the Rio Climate Change Treaty of 1992. Students of climate change will know that is the framework treaty that all these conferences of parties, including the one in Glasgow, sort of built on. And there's a policy logic to that framework. Note that countries make political commitments, not legal commitments. And that's a choice because the belief was in an uncertain area, you can get people to stretch more for political commitments than legal ones. On the other hand, because it's an uncertain area, you need ongoing scientific reviews. That's the IPCC process. And you also need ongoing meetings of the parties to continue to update those processes. There was also important concepts. I had to fight very hard, including against Germans at the time, to have the notion that we would have sinks as well as sources for carbon. And the notion you could have trading systems, because in a sense, the Germanic rules-based logic was in a sense, thou shalt not, pollute, not a question of how we'll manage this with economic efficiency. So I partly put that in there, and I could go through a similar riff on dealing with pandemics, because I think part of the challenge of diplomacy is how you integrate science with policy.
Actually, Bob, sorry, I thank you. My technology is obviously clearly not quite as much under my control as I would wish. That's a great moment, if I may, to segue to some of the questions that we have from our audience, because the present day effects of some of these historical examples, I think, is something that's been running through the theme. And Lawrence Lusgarten has just sent in a question in which Lawrence is asking, Do you think that the conflicts between China and the United States over several serious political and strategic matters will prevent them from cooperating in addressing the global environmental emergency? Because, even compared to that time that you were talking about in terms of pushing forward global policy, things, many would argue, have got worse, not better, in terms of the climate change issue.
Yes, and that's one of the issues that as the United States and its allies think about what relationship with a different China, you have to factor in. So let me give you a very specific example. When John Kerry was trying to lead the US effort on negotiations for the climate change conference in Glasgow, he recognized it was critical to try to have cooperation with China. He had to battle quite hard, actually, within the White House to even get what was a rather modest statement that the US and China issued together at Glasgow. But you could see for those following negotiations, even that mild statement had a big effect, because if the United States and China were aligning on something, it suggested some ongoing momentum going forward. But I would take this more broadly. It's one of the frustrations I have with some of the discussions of China policy today is that people don't factor in the downside of having a purely confrontational relationship. When I was working with China, I got the Chinese to support our efforts with sanctions on Iran and controlling Iran. And to tell you an interesting little anecdote, since I was the lead person in the Bush 43 administration on this, I visited Wen Jiabao before President Hu was going to come to see President Bush. And I'm emphasizing the importance of the Iranian point. And as I get into a car, a Chinese official says, look, we get it. We heard it. He said, we got three concerns. One, he said, we of course can't do exactly what you do. We have to be a little different than the United States. Two, we have interest in China or in Iran. And third, the Iranians are a little crazy. We don't know what they'll do. And so I said, good, this is exactly the type of dialogue that I was trying to develop, because separate it from pleasing the United States. Let's just look at China's self-interest. If you think that the Middle East is an important energy producing region of the world, and Iran has denied Israel's right to exist and the Holocaust, and it develops a nuclear weapon, I said, what do you think that's going to do to energy security in the Middle East for China's interests? So set aside the US perspective, think about your own. It's a good example, whether you're talking about North Korea or frankly, perhaps a little restraint on the Russians in Ukraine. A friend of mine reminded me in 2008, Medvedev went to the Shanghai Cooperation Conference and tried to get a resolution to support the actions in Abkhazia in Georgia. And China said, no, we're not going to do that. But today you'd have a different sort of posture. Now, I'm not saying that there's a view in the US, oh, does this mean we're making concessions for climate on other issues? That's not my view at all. I think you need to have a combination of deterrence on security issues with your allies. You need to manage differences and disputes, but you also need to find whether there's mutual interests and points of cooperation. And if I could, since you've studied so much what's happened within China, sometimes Americans still look at China as this sort of black box in terms of what goes on. I don't think the debate on China is finished on some of these economic reforms. Some of the things that Xi has done are not going to work. I believe over the next 5 or 10 years, there'll be some movements within China to sort of reassess. And frankly, I want the United States engaged with some of the Chinese officials to see if we can nudge them towards various policies. So again, I'm not trying to suggest that Chinese behavior will meet, sort of the total set of Western or US interests. But it comes back to this question of what is it you want to get done? And if you think containment's going to work, you're not even going to get the support of the Japanese, the Indians, the South Koreans, or the Australians. No one's going to contain China. How will you connect with it in a way that serves your interests, but also deters behavior you don't want to see?
Well, Bob, could I bring in the question here from who points out that decoupling is one of the words of the moment, one way or another. And the question he has for you is, do you feel with your expertise that there is actually any credible way to have what he calls a soft landing decoupling by the world's two leading economies that does not trigger a global upheaval or possibly even recession? In other words, is genuine decoupling possible, and is it possible without destroying the furniture?
Well, this is where, in a way, it brings you back to the reason I wrote the book, which is to talk about the practicalities of dealing with such problems. So take decoupling. I think you will see some decoupling for sure in the technology space, whether export controls and sort of other limitations from both sides. Um, the secondary area now is you're seeing in financial and investment flows. So the two foreign direct investment sort of flows have sort of been choked off, at least for the US and China. There's debates in the United States about whether you should permit US companies to invest in China. That's a current battleground. But then the third aspect is there's an awful lot of economic activity going on. If you look at American farmers, who are of an important political constituency, if you look at the energy sector, semiconductors is a wonderful one because actually the United States exports a lot of semiconductors to China at the same time that we say, well, we can't sell semiconductors. Well, the reality is semiconductors are a varied product. You've got some that are almost commodities, you've got some that's very high end. So how can you sort of structure some with limitations, but allow others to go forward? So I think, and if you look at US companies, this has hurt the political support because a lot of US companies are no longer making the case for China. But if you look at Apple, you look at Ford, you look at GM, you look at financial services companies, you look at Comcast, NBC, you look at Honeywell, and certainly the true with Britain as well. There's a lot of companies doing business in China that are an important part sort of the two-way relationship. So the question is that, can you manage sort of a partial disconnect? I'd like to think you can, but it requires this sort of ongoing interaction where you can explain in a trusted way, look, this will be an area where we're going to have constraints, or we're not comfortable with state-owned enterprises that we think are subsidized. And if we can't create disciplines for those, we're going to have offsetting tools. But that doesn't mean that you try to cut off the whole relationship. And the point I make to some of the pure hawks on this is that, China isn't going to go away, and our allies in East Asia are not going to divorce themselves from it. So it's a good example of, in a way, almost going back to Charles Evans Hughes or John Hayes or others. You're going to have to get, roll up the sleeves in terms of some of the details of this. And let me give you another couple examples that might help people grasp this. When China came into the WTO, it actually made commitments that were far deeper, as you probably know, than India or Brazil or others. On the quantitative side, they basically kept their commitments. On the qualitative issues, like enforcement of intellectual property rules or forced technology transfer, there were problems. But my approach would not just be to abandon it, but it would be to focus with China, which has its own interest in intellectual property. In recent years, China created a series of intellectual property courts that fine for foreigners about 85 to 90% of the time, but the penalties aren't high enough. So I push higher penalties. Forced technology transfer is prohibited by the accession agreement to the WTO, but companies are afraid to bring the evidence because they're afraid of retaliation. So I would press China to remove some of the joint venture requirements. And then the third area, are there things we don't like about Chinese behavior, such as subsidies and others, that frankly, we don't have international rules for? And if I were guiding US policy, one way I would try to sort of change that would be to promote those rules in something like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was based on US free trade agreements, and which the Trump administration withdrew and Biden's afraid to sort of re-enter. So that's shaping the international environment. So from a US perspective, it's not all bilateral. You have to do this with your allies and partners and multilaterally. But at the same time, you need to have the interaction with China to recognize there will be differences, there will be points of friction, but can you manage those without having a breakdown of the system? And by the way, look, at some point, you're going to have another global financial crisis if you just look at the history of global financial crisis. When that happens, as in the case of 2008, 2009, if China and the United States are not working together, it's going to be a very dark day. And so one of my other suggestions was this is an opportunity for the head of the IMF to pull together the participants in the special drawing rights, the SDRs, United States, China, European Union, Britain, and Japan, and have a regular group that tries to assess what's happening and in the economy, and when stuff hits the fan, be able to act cooperatively.
I want to squeeze in a couple more questions from people. They're now coming in thick and fast before we finish up. And that gives me a really good entry point just to put in a question, because I'm sitting, as many of our participants are, in the UK, recently left the European Union. You mentioned TPP. President Trump took the US out, but of course the CPTPP is an organization that Britain has just applied to come into and may yet get to enter this year. So I think the wider question that a lot of us would like to know, Bob, is does Britain have any chance of becoming, to use a phrase, a responsible stakeholder in international relations with China? The kind of country we are now, no longer in the EU, but with a genuine global outlook and an interest in the Indo-Pacific region, is there a role that Britain can play? And if so, what should it be?
Yeah, well, this is, of course, is part of the global Britain debate that all of you are having. I believe it's not only in Britain's interests, but it's very much in the U.S. interests. And if you think about international system, Britain is still what, the fourth or fifth largest economy. It can be a source of innovation. A lot of this will depend on your own domestic policies. You know, you've got defense capabilities that other Europeans don't have. Now, you know, it's not going to be a superpower, and it's not going to be sort of Britain of 1900, but can it be influential? Of course it can. And therefore, I think it's of U.S. interest to help Britain get connected into international systems as when it's no longer part of the European Union. So frankly, I think the AUKUS agreement, I know there's some dispute on this in Britain, but is important not only for the submarine arrangement, but frankly for the defense technology cooperation that we were talking about with Everbush. And I think it's a good thing that Australia has some optionality with Britain as well as the United States. I have proposed, and this is where, again, the U.S. sluggishness on trade is unfortunate. I would like to have the USMCA, the rewrite of NAFTA, have the three North American countries negotiate with Britain and be part of that economic arrangement. So it's in our interest for Britain to play on the global stage and European stage, obviously, with Ukraine. And obviously, that's part of resources and political support, but we should make it easier for Britain to do that, not ignore it.
Thanks, Bob. And I think for the last question I'm going to put to you as we come up to time, I'm going to bring together two questions that have come in through the chat, because they're essentially, it seems to me, aspects of the same issue. And that issue is the one that, you know, going back again, you identified in 2005, the question of whether China could be or would be a responsible stakeholder. That's about the rest of the world interpreting China's behavior. And I think we're still having that debate both within China and outside. So let me put these 2 points together. The first one is really about the BRI and the question of, you know, is China's use of its BRI mechanisms, and of course, as we know, it's not one thing, it's lots of bits, the private sector, the public sector all coming together, which essentially creates new sources of infrastructure and capital, actually a contribution to peace building, you might say, and infrastructure building in the global south? Or is it the debt diplomacy trap that its critics claim that it is? And linked to that is whether or not the authoritarian system of government in China will prevent it in the end from making that leap in terms of technology used not just at home, of course, but globally as well. In other words, they're both aspects of how's that responsible stakeholder challenge going at the moment?
Well, remember, I made a brief reference to using sort of the Belt and Road Initiative as an example of alternative international system, as opposed to working within the existing structure. China, in a sense, creates a tributary state model. And then, and I think this is a good case of where the United States and others need to press China on those exact issues with Belt and Road. And let me be more specific on this. You also had China develop the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank about the same time. And the head of the Jin Le-Quinn, the new head of the AIIB, frankly hired a bunch of people from the World Bank. He tried to have World Bank governance standards, tried to have environmental standards. And at least from what I've been able to see, they basically followed a lot of that. When I was in China, this was maybe a year or two before the pandemic, I gave a speech at the China Development Forum. And I said, because I worked with the Chinese, they pretty much let me sort of criticize them as long as I do it respectfully. And I said, look, no one knows what Belt and Road is. You know, is it a geopolitical venture? Is it an effort to try to sort of use excess capacity? You know, what is it, just simply a commercial export venture? You know, what is it about? And frankly, I think all these things are involved with what Belt and Road is about. And I said, but look, Look at the AIIB as a positive example. Part of the frustration that people have with Belt and Road is the lack of transparency and the lack of standards and the lack of open procurement and environmental and governance. Now, interestingly enough, on that same trip, a very leading Chinese official said, look, we've given your speech to Xi Jinping. And the next year, Xi Jinping actually made a lot of the same points. Now, that's not the same as following through. But if you don't have interaction with China, you're going to have less chance to follow through. And I'll give you a wonderful example that you'll see more of this year. As part of a project I started at the World Bank, I was trying to create open data and governance sources. And at William and Mary, they created a group that has looked at aid data systems. And they put together a data set on Chinese investment and assistance over 15 years, not for up to the past few, but if I think about 2000 to 2015, that is absolutely extraordinary in its reach. And then as they analyze the effect of Chinese assistance, which is somewhat different than their investment program, what do they conclude? Well, it's neither hero nor villain, it's mixed. There's a number of countries that rely on Chinese investment. There's a number that have had the debt trap. There's a huge problem with transparency of debt. Now, frankly, if I were in government, I would take that research and I'd have the relations with some of the Chinese I'd go to some of the Africans involved and say, look, here's what you have to be careful about. The types of systems that have a transparency, the types of, whether you want to have linkages to your own economy. I'd help the Africans because simply saying no to the Africans, oh, you don't deal with China, that's not going to work, okay? But I'd also go to the Chinese because you can see that in this study points some of this out. The Chinese don't want to have a bunch of bad debts. The Chinese don't want to have bad relations with some of these countries. So they're learning as they go. And it turns out, there's different projects done by different types of Chinese financial institutions. So the aspiration, going to your question, would be how can you help nudge Chinese policy so that it's more constructive for development, more constructive for the recipient countries. But if it's okay for China and world growth, that's a good thing too. But if you believe that everything that China does is a minus and you're trying to stop it, I'm afraid you're going to have these conflicts ranging from everything from biological security to conflicts to development. And by the way, this is another area where I think adroit use of the multilateral institutions can sort of create a more neutral forum to work with some of these issues. So I don't want to sound Pollyannish. There's a lot of problems with the Chinese investment in debt, and I emphasize the transparency. But it's a good example. I think over the next few years, you're probably going to have to restructure a lot of these debts, and you're going to want to do so in a way that sort of recognizes there's mutual interests.
Bob, I think that the depth and rigor of that answer indicates that if we had the time, then we could be sitting here for hours and hours discussing so many of these fascinating subjects. But time has defeated us on this occasion. I hope it's not. I'm sure it won't be the last occasion that we will have a chance to get together and talk one way or another. We have been immensely privileged to have your experience and wisdom for the China Center's audience this evening. We hope that at some point in the not too distant future, we can invite you over in person. I think that would be an evening that would then go on with drinks, dinner, and longer conversations. A reminder to everyone that the book is here, America in the World. Oops, I'm making sure it's getting focused on there too. But anyway, in case you can't see it, America in the World, A History of US Diplomacy and Foreign Policy. And it is a fascinating read, which sounds like everyone from policymakers to general students are getting the benefit from. We are very grateful and very privileged that you've joined us tonight at the Oxford China Centre, and very much hope to welcome you back again. Thank you so much for your time. And could we please have a big virtual round of applause for our guest tonight, Secretary Robert B. Zoellick.
Thank you for having me, Rana. And we all look forward to your next book.
Very kind to say. And thank you, audience, for joining us from around the world. And we look forward to seeing you again for many of our events. And Bob, I'm sure we'll be in conversation again. See you soon, I'm sure.